The moment the Sol Invictus appeared on the edge of the Galactic fleet's radar, the commanders of the Galactic Empire scoffed. The human ship was nothing compared to the massive, advanced warships of the Empire. It was small, outdated, and outclassed in every sense. But the officers on the Sol Invictus had one thing the Empire didn't expect: human resilience. They didn't come here to negotiate or bow down. They came to fight. Captain Alina Hayes stood firm at the helm of her ship, eyes locked on the incoming Galactic fleet. The crew aboard the Sol Invictus were no strangers to combat, but this was unlike any battle they had ever faced. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and yet there was something burning inside them, a fire that wouldn't be extinguished. The moment the Empire's ships came into range, the Sol Invictus opened fire. The first shots were weak, almost laughable in their comparison to the Empire's firepower. Yet, the Sol Invictus didn't stop. They didn't falter. Their crew knew that their one chance of survival was not in strength, but in strategy. Every shot they'd fired was aimed with precision, each blast targeting the weak points of the Empire's larger, slower ships. Despite the odds, humanity was making its stand. On the bridge of the Galactic, the flagship of the Imperial fleet, Admiral Vorn watched the battle unfold with a growing sense of disbelief. His fleet had faced countless civilizations. None had ever put up such a fight. The humans were reckless, fearless, and entirely unpredictable. They didn't fall into the usual patterns of other species, and their weaponry, though primitive in appearance, seemed to cause more damage than expected. "What are they doing?" Admiral Vorn muttered to himself. "They're out of their depth." His first officer, Lieutenant Drazer, tried to suppress his growing anxiety. "Sir, they've already disabled 2 of our smaller ships. They seem to be targeting our engines and power cores, bypassing our defenses entirely." Vorn's eyes narrowed. "These humans are more dangerous than they appear. Send in the second wave. Overwhelm them. They won't last long." The Empire launched its full might toward the Sol Invictus, a wall of fire and destruction that seemed certain to break through. But the humans weren't done yet. Captain Hayes barked orders, and the Sol Invictus swerved and weaved, avoiding several of the Empire's missiles with sharp, precise movements. The ship was no longer a passive target. It had become an agile predator in its own right. "We can't outrun them forever," said Lieutenant Collins, glancing at the holographic map of the battlefield. The human fleet was small, barely a match for the Empire's overwhelming numbers, but the humans had one thing that no one had counted on: adaptability. The fleet adjusted on the fly, using their smaller ships to create distractions and confusion in the Empire's formations. "We don't need to outrun them. We just need to make them hesitate," Captain Hayes replied, her voice steady, but filled with intensity. She knew that this battle was not just about winning. It was about sending a message to the Empire. Humanity wasn't here to be pushed around. They would stand their ground and fight to the very last breath. The Sol Invictus fired again, this time targeting a critical junction on the Galactic flagship, a vulnerable point they had identified after studying the Empire's ships. The shot hit, and a massive explosion rocked the Galactic. The flagship's shields flickered, and for a moment, the Empire's fleet seemed to hesitate. "What's happening?" Admiral Vorn asked, his voice rising in alarm. "How did they?" "We're losing power in several sections," reported his chief engineer. "Their shots are finding weak points in our defenses. It's as if they know exactly where to hit." Vorn clenched his fists. The Galactic had taken hits before, but never like this. The humans' attacks were precise, coordinated, and relentless. For the first time in his career, Vorn was uncertain. He had never imagined that a species so new to space exploration would pose such a threat to the might of the Empire. Back on the Sol Invictus, Captain Hayes watched as her crew worked tirelessly to keep their ship in the fight. They were outmanned and outgunned, but they weren't backing down. Every shot, every maneuver, every second mattered. Their small victories against the Empire's fleet weren't enough to win the battle, but they were enough to shift the tide of the war. The humans had proven something in those moments. They were not just a species of survivors. They were warriors. "Status report, Lieutenant," Captain Hayes demanded. "We've taken damage to the starboard engines," Captain Collins replied. "But we're still operational. The Empire's fleet is starting to regroup, though. They'll come at us harder now." Captain Hayes nodded, her mind racing through the possibilities. "Then we'll make them regret underestimating us." The fight continued, but something had shifted. The Empire's fleet had always relied on overwhelming force, and it had never considered the possibility that their enemies might fight back in a way that defied all expectations. Humanity wasn't just surviving the assault, they were changing the game. Back on the bridge of the Galactic, Admiral Vorn finally issued the order for a full retreat. His flagship was damaged, and his fleet was beginning to break apart. On board the Sol Invictus, Captain Alina Hayes was calm under pressure. She had trained her entire life for moments like these, but even she had to admit that the odds were stacked against them. The humans had no illusions of victory. This was about survival, and every decision could be their last. "Lieutenant Collins," Captain Hayes said, her voice steady, "what's the status on their fleet?" "They're breaking formation," Captain Collins reported. "It's like they're not sure how to handle us. The Empire's coordination is faltering. We've got them on the defensive." Captain Hayes nodded, understanding what that meant. For the first time since the battle began, they had a chance. The Empire's fleet, known for its sheer size and might, was beginning to show cracks. The Empire's arrogance had blinded them to the possibility that something as small as a human ship could pose a threat. The Sol Invictus wasn't just outnumbered. It was outclassed in terms of raw firepower. But it had something the Empire hadn't anticipated: ingenuity. "Let's make them regret underestimating us," Captain Hayes muttered, more to herself than anyone else. "Target their engines. Disrupt their power supply." The crew moved swiftly, executing the captain's orders with precision. The Sol Invictus fired once again, this time aiming for the core systems of the Empire's smaller ships. As expected, the attack struck home, and several of the Empire's ships lost power, drifting helplessly in space. The Galactic now looked less imposing. Its shields flickered weakly, its massive weapons systems failing to fully engage. The Sol Invictus had done it. It wasn't a decisive victory, not yet, but it was enough to make the Empire pause. It was enough to show them that humanity was not a species to be dismissed. Back on the bridge of the Galactic, Vorn stood frozen as his crew scrambled to assess the damage. His fleet was in disarray. The human ship had forced the Empire into an unfamiliar position, and it was one that Vorn had never been in before. Uncertainty. "We need reinforcements now," he ordered, his voice low but commanding. "Prepare for full-scale retaliation." But as he spoke, another transmission from the Sol Invictus came through, this one not a plea for peace or a request for negotiation. It was a warning, a statement. "We are humanity. You will learn to fear us." Vorn's eyes widened. The humans weren't begging for their lives. They weren't trying to avoid destruction. They were making it clear that they wouldn't back down. Not now. Not ever. The words sent a chill through him. These humans were not like the other species the Empire had conquered. They didn't know fear. And they weren't going to be intimidated by the Empire's power. "Get us out of here," Vorn growled. "We're regrouping. We need to rethink our strategy." The transmission cut off. The Sol Invictus had won the first round, not by overwhelming force, but by sheer determination. The humans had stood their ground, and in doing so, had shattered the illusion of Empire invincibility. The war was just beginning, and the humans had already made it clear. They were not going to be easy prey. As the Sol Invictus pulled back to regroup, its crew didn't cheer. They didn't celebrate. They simply knew that their survival depended on continuing to outthink and outfight their enemies. They were still vastly outnumbered, but they were no longer outmatched. The Empire had underestimated humanity, and they would soon realize that this mistake would cost them far more than they could imagine. The Empire had never faced an enemy quite like humanity before. Every plan they tried to execute against the Sol Invictus was met with stubborn resistance. The Empire's officers, trained to crush any opposition, found themselves struggling to outmaneuver a species they had written off as weak. They were no longer fighting a small, insignificant crew. They were up against humanity's drive, resilience, and an intellect that refused to bow to the might of the Empire. Admiral Vorn sat in his command chair aboard the Galactic, staring at the battle map with growing frustration. His fleet had suffered significant losses, and while the Sol Invictus was still taking hits, it was showing no signs of retreating. It was a strange feeling, this respect mixed with anger. Respect for an enemy that refused to break, anger for being forced to adjust strategies they never thought they'd need. "We're not dealing with primitive beings," Drazer, Vorn muttered to his first officer. "They're not like any species we've encountered before. These humans, they're cunning. Their adaptability is astounding." Drazer, who had always been loyal to the Empire's arrogance, was beginning to agree. "Sir, their ships, while small, are incredibly maneuverable. It's like they know exactly where to strike. And their crew, they work together like they've been at war for centuries." Vorn's eyes narrowed as he watched the Sol Invictus continue to press forward, taking advantage of every opportunity to strike. "They're playing a dangerous game, Drazer, but we will end it." Meanwhile, on the Sol Invictus, Captain Alina Hayes stood with her crew, studying the Empire's movements on the tactical display. They had won a few skirmishes, yes, but the battle was far from over. She knew they couldn't keep going at this pace forever. The Empire had far more ships, and eventually, their small fleet would be overwhelmed. "Captain," Lieutenant Collins spoke, his voice tight. "The Empire is gathering a larger force. We won't be able to evade them much longer. Our engines are starting to show signs of wear. The damage is beginning to take a toll." Captain Hayes nodded, her face set with determination. "We knew this was going to happen. We can't run from them forever. It's time to show them what humanity is really capable of." "Are we really ready for this?" Collins asked, his doubt flickering briefly in his eyes. "We don't have a choice," she replied firmly. "We make them pay for every inch of space they try to take from us." The time had come for humanity to show its true strength. The Empire had underestimated them once. They wouldn't make the same mistake again. Across the battlefield, the Empire was regrouping, bringing its might to bear on the Sol Invictus. But they still hadn't figured out the human secret. The Empire was used to overwhelming their enemies with superior numbers, but the humans didn't fight like anyone they'd ever encountered. Instead of brute force, they relied on speed, precision, and most importantly, the element of surprise. The Sol Invictus's small crew, despite being battered and bruised, refused to back down. They had fought off wave after wave of attacks, and now, with their backs against the wall, they prepared to show the Empire what they had been missing all along. "Ready the special payloads," Captain Hayes ordered. "Understood, Captain," Lieutenant Collins responded. "We'll need to make every shot count." The Sol Invictus's crew went to work, preparing their modified weapons. These weren't the usual missiles and laser blasts that the Empire had grown accustomed to. These were precision strikes, weapons designed to disrupt the Empire's fleet at a systemic level. It wasn't about destroying ships. It was about disabling their ability to fight back. Once the special payloads were ready, Captain Hayes gave the order. "Lock on and fire." The Sol Invictus fired a volley of specialized projectiles, each one aimed at a specific target on the Empire's fleet. The first hit was a critical blow. The Galactic flagship took a hit to its command systems, causing a ripple effect of chaos within the fleet. Shields flickered and failed, engines sputtered, and for the first time in the battle, the Empire's ships began to panic. Admiral Vorn watched as his flagship suffered the first real damage of the campaign. "What happened?" he demanded. "What was that?" We're not sure, sir," replied one of his technicians, his voice panicked. "It's some kind of energy pulse. It's affecting our systems. We're losing power to several sections of the ship." Vorn's heart sank. For the first time, his fleet was on the back foot. The humans had done something he hadn't anticipated, something they hadn't even shown during the earlier skirmishes. They had attacked the heart of the Empire's superiority, their technology. And the Sol Invictus wasn't done yet. The humans continued their assault, launching another round of energy pulses that targeted the Empire's smaller ships, disabling their engines and communication systems. The once formidable fleet was now scattered, disoriented, and struggling to regroup. "We need to counterattack now," Vorn shouted. "If we don't regain control of this situation, we're finished." But his crew was already starting to panic. The Empire had always been the aggressor, the conqueror. They had never been forced to defend themselves in such a way. The realization hit Vorn like a tidal wave. The humans weren't just fighting to survive. They were fighting to win. And they had just shown the Empire how powerful they could be when cornered. Meanwhile, Captain Hayes watched as the Sol Invictus continued its relentless assault. Their weaponry was primitive compared to the Empire's, but humanity had something the Empire didn't: unity. They weren't just fighting for victory. They were fighting for their home, for their families, for their future. And they would not stop until they had forced the Empire to understand that. "Status report, Lieutenant," Hayes asked, her voice calm despite the chaos around them. "We've disabled several of their smaller ships, Captain," Collins replied, his voice tinged with excitement. "Their flagship is badly damaged, but they're still regrouping. They're not giving up yet." Captain Hayes looked out at the Imperial fleet, which was beginning to regroup. "They'll come at us harder now. We need to prepare for the next wave. But we've proven something important today." Collins raised an eyebrow. "What's that, Captain?" "We've proven that we're not just a species to be dismissed," she said, "and that we can hit them where it hurts." And just like that, the tide had shifted. The Empire had finally seen humanity for what it truly was, a force to be reckoned with. The battle had reached a critical juncture. The Sol Invictus had proven that humanity was no longer the weak, untested species the Empire had once believed it to be. They had struck with precision, disrupted the Empire's systems, and shattered the illusion of invincibility the Empire had built over centuries. Now the Empire was on the defensive, its fleet struggling to regroup after the unexpected blows dealt by the humans. Admiral Vorn sat in his command chair, his fists clenched tightly around the armrests. His ship, the Galeris, was battered. Several of his fleet's smaller ships were inoperable, their engines down, their communications severed. The once proud fleet of the Empire was now a scattered mess of damaged ships, all attempting to reorganize under the ever-watchful eyes of the humans. Vorn could feel the pressure mounting. His officers were growing increasingly concerned, murmuring among themselves as the power of the Sol Invictus attacks took its toll. He had underestimated humanity, and now he had to face the consequences of that mistake. "Admiral," Lieutenant Drazer's voice broke through the tense silence. "We've lost contact with several of our smaller vessels. They've been completely disabled." Vorn exhaled sharply, frustration building inside him. "Keep your composure, Drazer. We still have more than enough power to crush them." Drazer hesitated, casting a glance at the tactical display. "I don't know, Admiral. The Sol Invictus is relentless, and they've done something to our systems. It's as though they know our weaknesses." Vorn's eyes narrowed. "I don't care if they know our weaknesses or not. We're the Empire. We don't lose to anyone, especially not these humans." But inside, Vorn wasn't so sure anymore. The Sol Invictus had shown an intelligence, a ferocity, and a resolve he had not expected. The humans were not the simpletons the Empire had believed them to be. They were fighters, and they were fighting with everything they had. On the Sol Invictus, Captain Hayes was reviewing the damage reports with her crew. Their small fleet had taken a beating, but they had done something the Empire never thought possible. They had made their enemy hesitate. "We've caused them serious disruption," Lieutenant Collins reported, his voice steady despite the tension. "Several of their ships are completely out of commission. They're trying to regroup, but they're struggling." Captain Hayes nodded, her gaze hardening as she watched the remains of the Empire's fleet attempt to reorganize. "They'll come at us again, harder than ever. We need to be ready." Hayes wasn't fooled into thinking this victory would last long. The Empire would send reinforcements, and when they did, it would be even more difficult to hold the line. She had to act fast. This was their moment to strike back. "Lieutenant," Hayes said, her voice cutting through the quiet, "send a message to every ship in our fleet. We've got one chance to make this count." Collins immediately relayed the message, and soon, the human ships were preparing for the final push. They knew the Empire wouldn't back down easily, but they also knew that the Empire had finally realized they were not just fighting a weak species. They were fighting a force capable of exacting real damage, and that was something the Empire hadn't been prepared for. As the human fleet moved into position, the Sol Invictus targeted the Galactic once more. This time, Captain Hayes ordered them to focus on disabling its weapon systems. The Empire's fleet, despite its size and firepower, relied on its ability to overwhelm. If they could take out their main weaponry, they might just be able to stop them. "Firing in 3, 2, Captain Hayes counted. Now, the blast struck the Galactic, sending shockwaves throughout the surrounding ships. The Galarus's weapon systems sputtered, then went dark as the disabling pulse cut off its ability to fire back effectively. The Empire's flagship was now vulnerable. "Direct hit, Captain," Collins said, a small smile creeping onto his face. "We've taken out their main guns." Captain Hayes allowed herself a brief nod of satisfaction. But she knew this wasn't over. The Empire would retaliate. They always did. It was just a matter of how and when. On the Galactic, Vorn's face turned white as he saw the effects of the humans' attack. His ship's weapon systems were down, and several of his crew were scrambling to reroute power to the backup systems. But it was too late. The humans had struck decisively. "Admiral, their firepower is too precise," Drazor said, desperation creeping into his voice. "They're targeting our weak points, and they're succeeding. We can't keep up with this level of coordination." Vorn gritted his teeth. "I refuse to let a human ship destroy us. We will fight back, no matter the cost." But Vorn knew something that Drazor did not. They were already past the point of no return. The humans had proven that they could disrupt the Empire's dominance, and now they were fighting with a confidence the Empire could not match. The Sol Invictus continued its assault, hitting more key points on the Empire's remaining ships. The Empire's once proud fleet was beginning to break apart. Its communications were failing, and its ships were becoming increasingly disorganized. The humans had struck fear into the hearts of the Empire's most experienced commanders. Back on the Sol Invictus, the crew was more determined than ever. "We've done it," Lieutenant Collins said, his voice filled with awe as he watched the Empire's fleet falter. "We've broken them." Captain Hayes didn't celebrate. Not yet. There was still more to do, more battles to win. "Not yet," she said. "We've cracked their confidence, but we need to make sure they don't recover. Keep up the pressure." As the human ships moved in for another round of precision strikes, the Empire began to realize something they had never considered. They had been beaten, not by numbers, but by strategy. The humans had shown them that sheer power and overwhelming force weren't the only ways to win a war. In fact, sometimes, the human mind itself could be the deadliest weapon of all. The war had taken a new turn. The humans had proven that they were more than just a nuisance to the Empire. They were a threat. And now, the Empire would have to reckon with the fact that humanity was no longer something to be dismissed. They were a force to be feared. The battle had shifted. The Empire, which once saw itself as the unstoppable force of the galaxy, was now reeling from the unexpected threat humanity presented. The Sol Invictus, though still battered and bruised, had struck with the precision and determination that only a species fighting for its survival could summon. And in doing so, they had exposed the Empire's most glaring weakness: complacency. Admiral Vorn stood on the command deck of the Galeris, his mind racing as the tactical display flickered in front of him. The damage to his flagship was severe, but it wasn't the physical destruction that haunted him. It was the realization that his fleet was faltering, that the humans had gotten under his skin, dismantling his perception of invincibility piece by piece. "Admiral," Lieutenant Drazer's voice cut through the tension. "We've lost contact with the Vortak and the Kalen. They're disabled. We're down to half our fleet, and the humans are pressing hard. We need reinforcements, or we won't make it out of this." Vorn clenched his jaw, his eyes narrowing. "We will not retreat, Drazer. We will show these humans why the Empire reigns supreme. They've caught us off guard, but it ends today." As he spoke, the Sol Invictus launched another wave of calculated strikes. Their energy pulses hit their mark with brutal accuracy, disabling the engines of 2 more Empire vessels. The once proud fleet of the Empire was now a disorganized mess, struggling to regroup and retaliate. They were being dismantled one ship at a time, their overwhelming numbers failing to compensate for their inability to adapt to humanity's unconventional tactics. "Captain Hayes," Lieutenant Collins called, his voice urgent as he watched the tactical display on the bridge of the Sol Invictus. "The Empire's flagship, the Galeris, is still in the fight, but their fleet is on the verge of collapse. If we strike now, we could end this once and for all." Hayes thought for a moment, her sharp gaze fixed on the image of the Galeris. She could feel the weight of the decision. One final push, one last strike to bring down the Empire's most powerful ship. But she knew it wouldn't be easy. The Empire's flagship had survived countless battles, and its command crew was as experienced as they came. They would fight tooth and nail to survive. "Set a course for the Galeris," Captain Hayes ordered. "We take down their flagship. We finish this." The crew of the Sol Invictus was fired up, their eyes burning with determination. They had fought long and hard to get here, and now they had the chance to end it. Humanity had already proven that it could stand toe-to-toe with the Empire, but bringing down the Galeris would send a message to the galaxy. Humanity wasn't just surviving, it was thriving, and it was here to stay. As the Sol Invictus made its move toward the Galeris, the Empire's flagship continued to fight back, launching desperate counterattacks. The Empire's remaining ships tried to rally around it, but they were too scattered, too damaged. The humans were relentless, and the Empire's ships were running out of time. Inside the Galeris, Vorn could feel the pressure mounting. His fleet was losing. The Sol Invictus's attacks had crippled his forces, and his flagship was now the last beacon of resistance. But he was not one to go down without a fight. He had spent his life rising through the ranks of the Empire, battling foes far more terrifying than the humans. He would not let this be his legacy. "Get me a direct line to the fleet," Vorn ordered. "Tell them to focus everything on the Sol Invictus. We have to stop them now, or we're finished." The Empire's remaining ships began to reorganize around the Galeris, all guns trained on the approaching Sol Invictus. The humans had proven their ability to disable Imperial technology, but Vorn was betting on the sheer firepower of his flagship to tip the scales in his favor. "Fire," Vorn commanded. The Galeris unleashed a barrage of laser fire, sending blasts toward the Sol Invictus. The energy shields of the human ship flared as they absorbed the hits, but it was clear the Sol Invictus couldn't take many more direct strikes like that. Hayes had to act fast. "Brace for impact," Captain Hayes ordered, her voice calm despite the chaos. The crew of the Sol Invictus did their best to brace against the impact as the shields flickered under the weight of the barrage. The ship groaned under the strain, but it didn't give up. Captain Hayes knew they couldn't afford to retreat now. If they faltered, the Empire would regroup and come back stronger. "We're not running," she muttered to herself, as much to reassure herself as to steady her crew. "We're taking the fight to them." The Sol Invictus launched another devastating salvo of precision-guided pulses aimed directly at the Galactic's command center. This time, the Empire's flagship couldn't avoid the attack. The pulses hit their mark, damaging the Galactic's central control systems and sending a shockwave through its entire fleet. Vorn staggered in his command chair as the ship's lights flickered and alarms blared. His ship was now vulnerable. His fleet was scattered and broken. His last hope was crumbling before his eyes. "No," Vorn whispered, his voice cracking. "Not like this." The Sol Invictus pressed forward, its weapon systems locking on to the weakened Galactic. Vorn watched helplessly as the final volley of fire came, and the once mighty flagship of the Empire was torn apart. The Galactic exploded in a massive burst of energy, its command center obliterated, and the Empire's morale shattered along with it. In that moment, the tide of the battle turned decisively in humanity's favor. "Victory!" Lieutenant Collins shouted, his voice filled with triumph. "We did it, Captain." Captain Hayes allowed herself a moment to breathe, but her expression remained focused. This was only the beginning. The Empire had been defeated, but the galaxy was vast, and other forces would soon rise to challenge humanity. For now, though, they had proven one undeniable truth. Humanity could stand against the might of the Empire, and win. The Empire's fleet, without its flagship, fell into disarray. Without Vorn to lead them, the remaining ships scattered, their captains unsure of how to proceed. The Sol Invictus and its fleet had broken the Empire's resolve. They had struck a blow for all of humanity, one that would echo across the galaxy for generations to come. But Captain Hayes knew the fight wasn't over. The Empire was down, but not out. There would be others who would rise to take its place. For now, though, they had won. Humanity had taken its first true step into the stars, and the galaxy would never be the same again.